Okay. So how about if I do a really quick review, because that poor guy is going to be expecting. So let's go back to here. The Titanic had many Jewish passengers and crew. The reason why we're studying this is because of what happened 4 weeks ago when the Titan submersible imploded. It started a desire to find out more about the Jewish history of the Titanic. This is the Titanic. It was the largest ship afloat at the time. And it represented the worst and deadliest peacetime sinking of an ocean liner. Here you have a picture compared to modern day cruise lines, how at the time it was the largest, but today it would be considered not even a secondary, but even a tertiary level size cruise ship. And here is the front page of the London Gazette. And one of the reasons why Jews were fleeing and they were so widely found on the Titanic was that in Eastern Europe, Western Russia, northern Ukraine, things were very, very bad for the Jews. Children were being conscripted into the army starting at the age of 12 and sometimes 8. So there was a tremendous flood of Jews fleeing Eastern Europe and coming to America. This is what steerage looked like. It was really cramped. It was really bad conditions. But on the sister ship, the Olympia, there was actually a kosher kitchen. And this is a plate from the Olympia. It is not from the Titanic. It's from the twin sister. And here, this is very interesting. This is the White Star Line specimen third class bill of fare. And if you look on, again, this is, if you look on the very bottom, it says kosher meat supplied and cooked for Jewish passengers as desired. And this is the original. This isn't a replica. It is actually when people would, investigate and say, what ship should I go on? These are things that they would see. Oh my gosh, there's kosher food. As I mentioned earlier, I remember as a young kid flying to New York, certain airlines in the early 70s didn't necessarily have kosher food on flights. Very interestingly, this is a very upsetting photo that the Titanic was doubted as unsinkable, but only half of the number of lifeboats were available for the passengers. In third class, it was the hardest to escape because it was a maze of lower floor cabins. The loss of life was exceptionally heavy and disproportionate among third class passengers. Of the 710 third class passengers, only 1/4 escaped. That was according to the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. Only 25% survived. Chevra, please make sure that you are muted if there's going to be noise in the background.
Hey, Rabbi.
Yes, Jonathan.
One interjection here. There were, falsely, they claimed there were not enough lifeboat space for everyone, and that's not true. There actually was enough lifeboat space, but too many of them left with very empty.
Exactly. So if you look here on the very bottom, that's exactly what I wrote. Many lifeboats, such as the one, was less than half full and was overstaffed by able-bodied seamen and crew. So what happens is, I was reading this article about it, and if you look closely here, you can see able-bodied men and crew. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them, and that means there's only like 12 women and children. And these boats can hold up to 35, right, Captain Dickens?
I'm not certain the total number,
so
but I did read
there were
about
different
that.
size boats. There were different life size, and they said 25 to 35.
Okay.
I look at this picture and I don't see it, but what was absurd, this was taken by someone on the Carpathia, which was the ship that rescued them. If you look closely, you can see that no way around it. It should have had maximum of 2 able-bodied seamen, not 5. And why is it? It's basically empty. It should have been stuffed rather than basically empty.
And Rabbi, one more thing. It was very calm weather, and you can see, look how calm that is for the North Atlantic. That's so calm. So they could have overloaded the boats well beyond the 25, 35.
Especially since People didn't die from drowning, they died from hypothermia. So you're absolutely correct. It was a real tragedy. It was,
And they wouldn't go back. They wouldn't go back. And in that
right,
movie, they did say, because what if they capsize us? But I just cannot imagine that
right.
how terrible these crew were.
So there were also, I was reading secular accounts. Apparently, there were some very amazing stories of heroism, and we're going to read about two of them. But there were also extreme cases of cowardice amongst men. The crew apparently acted very admirably, typical British sailors, from what the accounts. Um, but the British, noble class and the elders did not. So let's move on real quickly. Halacha on the Titanic. This is something that um, I was reading the story about it. So according to Jewish law, um, when a person gets divorced, you have to get a get. So of the 1,500 people who drowned, only 340 bodies were recovered. A young Jewish woman named Sylvia Meisner survived, but her husband's body was never found. And apparently she was in her mid-20s. They had no children. This resulted in her difficult halachic status as an aguna. It literally means a chained woman who cannot prove she is widowed or divorced. Without a body, how can you prove that she's a widow? How can you allow her to remarry? Aguna cannot remarry until proof validates her status. In this particular case, she was permitted to remarry. So they convened a Beit Din in New York, and it was a very interesting halachic statement. So in the Talmud, it discusses a very similar situation about a person who went down to a large body of water and said to everyone, I'm going down to this large body, to the Yam, to the sea, and he disappears. Okay, and the question is, can his wife remarry? A day goes by, 2 days, 3 days. Can we assume he died? So the halacha is, if you can walk around the water in 1 day or less, you can't assume he's dead. You have to assume that he swam to the other side or someone saw him floundering. And instead of after getting saved, he decided not to come back and he went on his way, went to make his fortune. But if you cannot walk around the perimeter of the water in 1 day, you assume just the opposite, that the person drowned. So the rabbis decided that his existence in the water after, I think it's like 8 to 12 minutes, would definitely die. It wasn't a question of him being able to swim. Plus, there was many incentives to identify yourself as a survivor. And the reason is because the cruise line gave people money. So there was many incentives to prove that you survived. And because he didn't, after a whole year, there was no proof and no finding of the body. Plus, there were over 1,200 lost bodies. The rabbis decided, according to halacha, she would be allowed to remarry. And at the time she remarried, she was, I believe, only 22. Is that the same chat? Let me just see. Steve offers, it was probably a business decision to offer kosher food because of the large Eastern European Jewish migration to America, which brought over 1 million Jews to the United States. Many of the major passenger lines crossing the Atlantic began offering kosher food service for the Jewish passengers, mainly immigrants in third class. The Titanic kosher cook was Charles Kent. Yes, we mentioned that. Yes, Steve. His name was, I'm not sure. I think that it sounds right that the reason why there is kosher food is an incentive. The Titanic was definitively the 5-star of the 5-star cruise lines. So having a kosher kitchen would not have been difficult for them. And you're right, it would be an incentive. I can also tell you that at Ellis Island, if you've ever been to Ellis Island, they have a memorial to those immigrants that died in transit. because steerage was really unhealthy. There was poor ventilation. There was very poor bathrooms and sanitation, and sometimes um, you had to buy your own food or bring your own food. It was very, very difficult. And I remember one particular story of a Jewish woman that arrived 9 days in transit, and she died from not malnutrition, she died from starvation. And it was a really sad story. If you Google it, you'll find it. And the reason is because no one offered her food. So, and she died at was then the hospital, the Jewish hospital at Battery Park. So interesting, stories of it. What you see on the right is these modern day demonstrations in Israel. What you have here is there's this man who owns an optical store and in Jerusalem, and he's been refusing to give his wife a Jewish divorce, and she is called an aguna, a woman, a chained wife. So why isn't he giving her a get? Well, he wants out of child support. He wants out of alimony, or just the opposite. He doesn't want the children, once a month. He wants the children 2 Shabbases a month. He wants them for Sukkot and Passover. So it's like not a bargaining chip, but rather blackmail. And there's a number of people, both men and women, who go to their place of employment or their businesses, and they do demonstrations, sometimes hundreds and hundreds of people. Also, these groups go to his synagogue on Shabbat, and they stand around him and they shame him for not giving his wife a get, keeping her chained. And the reason why it's a real issue is because these religious women want to have children, and they can't remarry, and it's absolutely criminal. In Israel, by the way, it is illegal not to give a wife a get. However, what these men do is they use legal loopholes to delay it. There was a Yemenite man who refused to give his wife a get, and he sat in jail in Israel for over 30 years, dying in jail rather than giving his ex-wife a get. So that's how sad it can be. Let's move along. Some of the most famous Jews that died. This is Benjamin Guggenheim. He was a famous American mining magnate. He was offered a lifebelt and a spot with women on a lifeboat, but he refused. He was quoted as saying, "No woman shall remain unsaved because I was a coward." Surviving witnesses testified that after he assisted the officers in getting the women in the boats, he was last seen on the forward deck. I'm not sure if I spelled that right. I think it's ARD, with a jest upon his lips. I'm not sure what that meant, but apparently he wasn't whining and crying. He was a proud man, very wealthy. In 1912, I should have put it down, he was worth $70 million in 1912. And I understand today that would be like $3.5 billion. I saw it online. I should have more specific and copied that. Another famous person and his wife, they're both very famous, Isidore and Ida Strauss. They were the co-owners of Macy's department stores in New York City. Though the women first policy could have saved Ida Strauss, she refused to abandon her husband in his last hours, and they perished together. In the movie, there's a famous scene where they're in bed, but that's conjecture. She did refuse to get on a boat. She refused to leave her husband. They were obviously very much in love. A really beautiful love story. This is a side story. This is Isidore's brother, Nathan Strauss. They were touring Europe, the brothers, with their wives. All 4 were supposed to embark on the Titanic together. Nathan and his wife had tickets on the Titanic. Their last tour was a last-minute trip to the Holy Land. Nathan and his wife were struck by the overwhelming poverty and tremendous piety of the Jews that lived in Jerusalem. So he and his wife decided to remain in Palestine a few extra weeks. Instead of returning with his brother, he stayed and opened 4 soup kitchens, a series of child welfare stations, children's schools, and a number of emergency medical clinics. Those clinics would eventually become known as the Strauss Medical Center. They named a city after him. Netanya is named after Nathan Strauss. By the
Fantastic.
way, yeah, and the Strauss Medical Center is in Netanya. But even in Jerusalem, in the old section of the German quarter, there is still a clinic called Beit Natan, and it's an emergency center that used to be a building that he bought and turned into like a clinic. He also brought doctors, Jewish doctors from Europe, and Jewish nurses. He hired them away and brought them to Israel. So because he decided to stay, he didn't get on the Titanic. And that's, he was saved from the Titanic by not getting on the Titanic because he opted to do the mitzvahs of protecting the land of Israel. Another Titanic side story. One fortunate third-class passenger was Abram Joseph Hyman. He survived. After the rescue, he ended up in Manhattan. He noticed kosher delis on every corner. After overcoming years of near-phobic revulsion of sea travel, Joseph returned to England and opened a kosher deli, and he named it the Titanic. Deli remained open, albeit under different ownerships, all the way up until 2016, or 104 years. And if you look closely in this picture, until it closed, it was kosher. And the gentleman who owned it, that's him. If you look closely, you can actually see he's wearing a yarmulke. Now, Hyman was known as Mr. Titanic. That's what they called him. And by the way, is it true? Is it not true? His cousin was sick and tired of paying his bills. He wasn't doing well in Manhattan. So how did his cousin get him back to England? He bought him a ticket on a steamer. He got him drunk until he passed out, and he hired 2 sailors to carry him onto the ship. That's the story that was frequently told about how Abraham Hyman got back to England. Regardless, somehow he overcame his phobia of sea travel, and this is what Hyman's Titanic's Limited Kosher Butcher and Deli, 130 Waterloo Road, Manchester, England, which is about 200 miles north of London. And this is what it looked like. I'm not sure if that's Hyman himself, but this is what it looked like in the mid-50s. Looks like a pretty damn good deli. I'd buy a pickle there. I'm not wearing yarmulkes though, but I don't know. I'd still buy a pickle. What do you think? So the whole idea was his nickname was Mr. Titanic, and he named his deli the Titanic. Now, is that taking advantage of a tragedy? Yeah, or maybe it's making lemonade out of lemons. I don't know. This is something really important about how the Jews responded to the Titanic. The Jewish community viewed the sinking of the Titanic as a collective personal tragedy. The Yiddish lyricist Shlomo Small, by the way, his grandson is Rabbi Small of Chicago. He penned the original song called Der Nasser Kever, or the Watery Grave. The lyric ended with a stanza honoring Ida Strauss, the woman who would not be saved. And this is the beautiful words. Listen to that woman's soul. I won't stir from this spot. I'll die here with my husband. An illustration published along with the sheet notes, the sheet music of the song, was a photo of a man and a woman hovering above a stormy Titanic with halos over their heads, with an angel placing it there, in dedication to Ida and Isidore Strauss. And it's pretty amazing because I mean, it was done in Yiddish. The song's in Yiddish, a tribute to those who perished. Now, this is more like a social, cultural. How about this? This is one of the world's most famous, greatest cantors of history. His name was Yossele Rosenblatt, and he recorded a special Kel Malay Rachamim, a memorial prayer in dedication to the fall of the Titanic. In the words, he changed the words of the Hebrew and he added, "For the people of the Titanic who drowned in the sea and are gone to their eternal home." He altered the words in Hebrew. The new album, which raised $150,000 in 1912, was contributed by Rosenblatt. He didn't take a penny to the fund for the families who lost loved ones on the Titanic. Now, if you look here in the picture, you can actually see, what does it say? It says Victor Records, which later became, I think, NBC. It has the picture of the dog listening to the Victorola. And it says, if you look closely, the famous, he hears his master's voice. In the Hebrew, it says, El Malay Rachamim, for the Titanic. And obviously cantor Yossele Rosenblatt. For the first Hungarian congregation, Ohev Tzedek was the name of the shul, with organ accompaniment. And that's a picture of him. Now, the whole point is, no one today would ever say, oh, he was conservative or reform. He was what we would call today ultra-Orthodox. He was Haredi. He was mainstream yeshiva, black hat, so to speak. But the whole point is that, in fact, if you look closely, under his talis, he's wearing a Hasidisha black kapata, a bekisha. So it was so tragic, the loss of the Titanic, that even in what we would call today the ultra-Orthodox world, they were doing memorials to those who perished. Why? Because there were so many Jews who perished disproportionately on the Titanic.
Rabbi,
Yes.
can you bring it back a second?
Yes.
You noticed how it's spelled El?
What spell?
El. In El Malay Rachamim, how El is spelled with an
Yeah.
I?
Because it's the Yiddish.
I was wondering.
It's the Yiddish. Because
Yeah,
if you look
but
in the
the
parentheses,
Mala is not Yiddish, would have been an Aleph there. Mistake.
it has to do with,
And-
it's not a mistake. It's the way they do it in Yiddish. Because if you look in
Really?
the parentheses is also Yiddish, and the translation, and they
Yeah,
use
the
it.
parenthesis is for sure Yiddish, yeah.
It's just the way they spell it. Also, maybe it's because they don't want to take God's name in vain and write it.
Maybe because of that,
Yeah.
yeah, that I would say
But
rather.
I've also seen it print Aleph Hey Lamed El Malay Rachamim.
Yeah,
Okay. All right. Historians are uncertain of the exact number of Jewish passengers on board. Using classical Jewish family names and survivor accounts, there were 31 Jews in first class, 13 in second class, 23 in third class, and 2 crew members. Unofficially, if I'm not mistaken, that came out to it comes out to like 71 or something like that. I should have done the math. So
67.
67. There's an additional 125 suspected Jews. Of those passed, why? Again, because so many of them used altered names. Also, they were afraid of being sent back because many of them were fleeing, what would you call it today? At Ellis Island, they would send you back if you were on a list of people who owed money back in Europe, because we didn't want to become Australia, a nation of debtors and a nation of thieves and a nation of, people who are fleeing debt. So that's why a lot of them definitively use non-Jewish sounding last names. A debate continues regarding the number of Jewish victims due to name changes, as I mentioned, visa fraud, cultural spellings of last names, German and Jewish name similarities. For example, the name Miller, the last name Miller, is it Jewish
German.
or is it German?
German.
Now, if you tell me
Oh.
Mueller is the German spelling, that's not necessarily accurate. There are plenty of Germans who spelt it Miller as well. So that's why, but regardless, official or unofficial, that the Hebrew Sheltering and Immigrant Aid Society sheltered hundreds of people who survived. And a lot of times, there are people that they weren't identifiable as Jewish or non-Jewish because their families were afraid of identifying them as Jewish because their survivors might be sent back for, like I mentioned, visa fraud or immigration fraud. This is in Halifax, Nova Scotia. This is known as the Titanic section of the Baron de Hirsch Cemetery. And what happened was they did recover a number of bodies, and the Jewish tradition is that we bury them right away. And rather than ship them back to England or ship them to the United States, the Jewish community of Nova Scotia buried them. What's really interesting, this gentleman in the middle is Rabbi Jacob Walter, and Fred Bishop, that's this person in the corner, supervised the unveiling of the headstones for the victims, which was paid for by
White Star
White
Line.
Star Line. They paid, they really did. They paid reparations. They really went out of their way. Apparently, the ship was very well insured, and that's one of the famous conspiracies. That White Star Line, the White Star Line was going bankrupt, and that they gutted their own ship for the insurance. It's mishugas, but they did. Go ahead, Captain.
Yeah, I was just gonna, was their pride and joy. This was the most phenomenal ship out there. They were trying to set a faster time record across.
Right.
A lot of mistakes. They had warnings that there were icebergs and drifting ice.
No, chat. Put on chat.
And
There were also there was also a number of discussions that the head engineer, I don't want to say architect, they often refer to him as an architect. I don't think he was. I think he was really an engineer. That he continuously begged them to stop. That it was not, good. But also, there's a very famous story. Maybe Captain John, you can help explain it. That there was they didn't have a wireless on board, and that there had been a year earlier there had been a capsizing of there was a ship that floundered, and because they had a wireless, everyone survived, a wireless radio. And this guy even spoke in Congress in like 1911 and told people, in the industry, the committee, what we would call the NTSB, and said, look, it doesn't cost anything. All you have to do is pay, a wireless guy, or three of them, because they have to be on for 8 hours a day. And you know what? It'll save lives. And they didn't do it. Unfortunately, what's the saying? Closing the barn after the horse gets out. After the Titanic, every ship had to have a wireless radio, which would have made all the difference. So
they did have Morse code,
right,
and which required a radio operator. They weren't called radio back then, but must have been telegraph operator. So they could communicate, and that's how they did communicate with the ship that did finally get there.
But the problem, yeah, go ahead.
The reason no ships were close enough because they followed the reports that there are ice flows and don't go in this area.
Right. Wasn't there also a case where the guy up in the crow's nest didn't have his binoculars because the guy who immediately preceded him on watch locked them up there and didn't leave the key? Did you ever hear that story?
Yes,
Yeah, I've heard something like that. Yes, but I'll tell you, the ship, they claimed it was unsinkable.
Yeah.
So first of all, if anything man-made, I would never claim it's anything,
Right.
can't happen, never, Murphy's Law, but
Right.
it would have been if they did not, the walls that compartmentize and give the ship strength going laterally, a thwart ship across the side, lengthwise, but across, and it divides the ship into all these sections. Those bulkheads or walls did not go from the bilge, the bottom, all the way to the upper deck and be welded or riveted to the top. They only went 7/8 of the height. So there was space at the very top where once water filled in a compartment, if it did go to the top, it would stay in that one compartment and the ship could float with probably, I think they said 3 full flooded compartments. The people would have been out on the decks,
Right.
moved fore or aft, and would have been fine. But because it went to that up, each one will fill up to the very full point,
Right.
and it flooded over the top to the next compartment again and again and again.
Oh.
And that's why she sank. So from that day forward, they learned got to have them from the bottom to the top.
Wasn't there a conspiracy that the Jews sank the Titanic?
Nice, it's just
Yeah.
okay.
It was, yeah,
Iceberg, Goldberg.
Yeah, we already heard that.
yeah, you joined too late. You joined too late. That's how I
Exactly, too
started.
late. My God.
Your dad joke was already said by the rabbi.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah,
you,
yeah.
Rabbi. Thank you for
Okay.
quoting me, Rabbi.
Okay, so real quickly, because we're rapidly approaching an hour. This is a famous story with, you've often heard me quote Rabbi Reamer. All of my stories are true. In fact, some of them even happened. So I'll give you the quick story. This Sarah and Leah Axe actually fled Poland. They fled from Lodz. They got to Southamptons, and she was pregnant, so she stayed in Liverpool, I think it was actually. And the husband Sam went ahead, and he went to Norfolk, Virginia. By the way, a lot of Jews in Norfolk, Virginia, including my father's first cousins, all lived in Norfolk.
Rabbi,
Yes.
it's Norfolk. It's not Norfolk. Having lived there, it's Norfolk.
Oh, really? So wait until you hear me say New Orleans.
Nolans.
Listen, my wife is you know, is from 25 miles north of Boston, and I cannot begin to tell you how many times they corrected me because I forgot it's not Gloucester and it's not Leicester. John, how do you pronounce it?
Gloucester.
Gloucester, and what's the other one?
Leicester. And they say everything wrong up there. It's just funny.
Then in
Yeah.
Carolina, it's not Leicester. It's Leicester.
So it's definitely Norfolk. You're right. It's Norfolk. Okay. So that being said, what the story is that she gave birth, and then her husband sent her money, and she booked passage on the Titanic. And the baby's name was Ephraim Fischel. They were very religious. And what happened was the story that they frequently told was that she went up to the deck, and there's all kinds of stories how she finally got up to the deck, and there was a man that inappropriately got onto a lifeboat, and he was dragged off by the crew, and they snuck onto another lifeboat, and they dragged him off screaming and yelling, and apparently he had like a nervous breakdown, and he grabbed, this is their story, he grabbed the child from her arms and threw the child over the side.
Oh my God.
And she had to be hysterically placed into a lifeboat. Now, when she was rescued by the Carpathian, and 2 days later, in her, how do you say it, in her confusion, she was walking on the deck, and she heard a baby crying. She walked over, and it was Ephraim. And the woman who was holding the baby said, no, it's my baby. And we documented the woman's name. The woman's name, it's here somewhere. Either Mrs. Elizabeth Rommel Nye, and others say it was Ariane Del Carlo from Italy. And she said, no, this baby's been entrusted to me. I was in a lifeboat and the baby fell from the heavens and I'm keeping this baby. Regardless, it is documented that they called the captain because they started screaming over the baby. It's my baby. No, it's my baby. So the captain brought them into his private chambers, and the mother said, I can prove to you, it's my baby. He's circumcised. We're Jewish, and the baby is circumcised. In 1912, only Jews circumcised their baby. And sure enough, the captain very wisely checked and confirmed that the little baby was circumcised and gave the baby back to the rightful owner. Now, other stories don't have such a dynamic story, even though that was the story that the Acts used to tell, that the baby was literally thrown over. Others say that the baby was just separated from the mother, that someone grabbed the child to put him in a boat, thinking that the mother was already in the boat, whatever, they were definitely separated. But the story is true in that the captain had to forcibly bring the child back. Now, Mr. Axt, or Frankie, or Philly, his name was actually Ephraim Fischel. He was a member of Bethel Temple. He was a member of the Khedive Shrine Temple, and he was a Shriner, a Mason, and the Jewish Community Center. He was an active as a Freemason, and I even have his address, 900 block of Armfield Circle in Norfolk. The last 2 decades of his life, he became very, very active and collecting Titanic memorabilia. And when the last years of his life, he donated it to the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia. And after the release of not the famous Titanic, what's his name, with the famous one that came out in 1995.
Leonardo DiCaprio.
Not that one, but there was another one that came out in the 50s. After the release of that first Titanic feature film, which was made by Fox.
Remember that one.
And also A Night to Remember. He and his mother used to travel, and they were frequently guest speakers. And they were very active in what's called the Titanic Historical Society. And he used to attend many conventions well into the 1980s. I didn't have pictures for more room for pictures, but there's a picture of him and his mother in the 50s. He was then a young man at a dais answering questions. So let's real quickly go to the next one. So there's actually a Titanic and Holocaust connection. The Strausses, the ones who perished, they had a nephew who was named Nathan, and he was a college friend of Anne Frank's father, Otto Frank. They were in Heidelberg University together. In 1909, way before, when he was only 22 years old, Nathan convinced his father to offer Otto Frank a job at Macy's in New York. And he came to New York. Deborah, please remember to mute yourselves. I can't tell who it is, but there's noise in the background. So Otto Frank came to the United States. He thought his parents encouraged him because it'd be good for practicing English, learn, before they went into the banking business in Frankfurt. He came to New York, returned to Germany in 1911 when his father passed away. Strauss and Otto Frank remained good friends. They even went on a vacation together in 1928. When Otto needed help to get his family out of Holland in 41, he wrote to Nathan Strauss Jr. After the invasion of the families, lost contact with the families, and they went into hiding in 1942. Anne Frank, Margot Frank, and died in Bergen-Belsen, and Otto Frank, and the mother passed away in Birkenau. Otto Frank was freed when the war was ended. He reconnected with Nathan Strauss in September of 45, and Strauss helped Frank get Anne's diary and the diary of Anne Frank get it published in 1952. And it was Nathan Frank who was the one who got Eleanor Roosevelt to write the foreword to the first edition. So that's the history connection with the Titanic. So I hope you guys enjoyed class. Got any questions for me? How about for Captain Nicken, because he is a real authority on maritime engineering. I mean, Like I said, he is a graduate of Kings Point, United States Merchant Marine Academy. Hey, wait, is that a picture of you and you?
Can you see it?
Well, the problem is oh, there you are. Oh my God, you look like a baby. You haven't changed that much. Is that what is it, a picture?
Yeah, it's a photograph. I got to show you better. Hold on. Let me get rid
Actually,
of
it looked pretty good.
the background or something. Something's wrong.
Yeah. Well, Heather, I hope you
But go
enjoyed the
ahead.
class. I hope you enjoyed the class. There really is a lot, a couple of other interesting footnotes or a couple other Jewish laws involved. But it still took me I'd like to keep it to an hour because I don't like to go over. There are 2 chats. Let me see if I can read the chats. Let's see. It was RCA. Okay. Not NBC. Did RCA buy it? I think there was some connection there. Thank you, Beverly. Coincidentally, Steve writes, Passover in 1912 was between April 2nd and April 10th. The Titanic departed on April 10th. Perhaps even more Jews might have sailed if the timing was different on the last day of Pesach. Very good. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed class. And
Excellent.
have a good
Very
evening. We'll
interesting.
see you in Minyan tomorrow morning.
Excellent. Rabbi,
Bye
really
now.
enjoyable.
Thank you, Captain Nicken. From you, it means a lot. Thank you, because you know your maritime history, and
It
thanks
was
for your
great.
contribution.
That was great.
Thank
Laila
you.
Tov, everyone.
Very interesting,
Lato,
thank you.
Rabbi.
Excellent.